And I mean, I'm glad they finally said it in Endgame, but like in the comics, Avengers Assemble is always shouted at the top of one's lungs. Like it is a call to action. It's not a little thing Cap whispers to himself.
Says it to himself. Assemble.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Hello and welcome to Science Sort of. You're listening to episode 339. Our theme for this week is Voices. Assemble. I'm your host, Ryan, and joining me to talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science, it's Caitlin Bergstrom.
Hello.
And Megan Johnson.
Hi.
And Becca Van Hoeck.
Hey, Ryan.
Y'all are joining me today because you are our AGU rep and my cohort in the Voices for Science program. So we're going to talk more about the program later, but Caitlin, real quick, as our AGU person, can you give us like a brief 1 or 2 sentences about the whole idea behind Voices for Science and how the 4 of us became this little unit?
Sure. So Voices for Science was the brainchild of our Science Policy Department and our Science Communications Department at AGU in 2017, when more of our scientists wanted to become more engaged with science communication and science policy. So we launched a program that is monthly mentor calls with a cohort of folks sort of in your region. We're a little bit all over the place for our group here to chat, talk about the work that you're doing, and complete at least one science policy or science outreach action per month.
Nice. And so I was the only person in DC in the policy side of things, So there's like a policy track and a media track. That's like the main bifurcation in the 2 different groups.
Yes.
All 3 of us were policy people, but I got paired up with the North Carolina group. So Megan and Becca, you are both North Carolinians, at least at this stage in your lives and careers.
We are.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, Megan, you are at the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center at North Carolina State University. Remind me where that is in the state? Raleigh?
Yeah, that's in Raleigh, yeah.
And Becca, you are a grad student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, yes?
I am, yes.
Awesome. And so one thing I like to do, and Caitlin, I'll give you a chance to do this when we're in our second segment, but for Megan and Becca to start, I often like to ask people what kind of scientists that they tell people they are, and like how does that answer change based on who you're talking to? Like, do you have an answer that you give when you're sitting next to a person on a flight, which is something I barely remember doing, or like when you're at the grad seminar and you can trust that people can maybe get a bit more of the nuance? So like, what are your various answers for the kinds of scientists you are? Megan, I'll pick on you to go first.
Sure, yeah. Well, so I'm an environmental engineer and also an atmospheric scientist, and saying both of those things, it's a lot of syllables. So definitely talking to people like on the plane, I just say, I study air quality. And if they want to know more, I can go into more detail. But it's just a lot easier to say, I study air quality than saying all of the above.
And Becca, you?
I guess I have a couple tiers. So my go-to answer is usually marine ecologist. If I'm talking to kids, though, I say biologist. So I say I'm a marine biologist when I'm talking to kids. Definitely what I aspired to be as a 10-year-old. So like to kind of give that input there. But then if I'm in my actual kind of science field circles, we could get a little bit more specific and say that I'm a marine soundscape ecologist.
Ooh.
But largely marine ecologist fits the bill.
I imagine our editor's ears just perked up at hearing that, like, oh, marine sound ecologist. So you might be getting an email from him. Megan, I tend to think of you, correct me if I'm wrong, as a bit of a fire person. You're kind of my go-to, especially last year. We've been, as I think I kind of hinted from the way this program works, is we've been having monthly conversations over the last year. Last year was a pretty horrific year for fire, so I've started associating you in my mind as a fire person, a firebender in the Avatar world. So is that a fair characterization, or how does fire and air quality work together in your world?
Yeah, we actually have, for the people in my research group, we have a group chat and we've titled it Airbenders. So I definitely associate a little bit more with the airbender side than the firebender side. But yes, my research is specifically on wildland fire, which is prescribed fire and wildfire smoke. So how that smoke moves through the air and how that affects people's health for the most part. So there's a lot of different things that go into that. But yeah, it all comes down to air and fire for me.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit more, and then we'll talk with Becca a little bit more about marine ecology and soundscapes. So, what kind of tools do you use to assess these sorts of things? Are you monitoring? Are you conducting experiments? What are some of the tools you bring to bear to collect data, and how do you interpret it?
Yeah, so I've kind of moved throughout my science career, kind of going through, monitoring and lab work type stuff, and I've kind of graduated to the point where I'm just sitting in front of a computer looking at other people's data for the most part, or simulating it in a model. So some of the work I'm doing, I'm kind of pulling together data from a bunch of different sources. I'm looking at monitor data of particulate matter and trying to figure out how much of that is impacted by smoke. And I'm trying to do simulations myself with different models, both kind of simplistic models that somebody who might be trying to plan like a prescribed burn, they might use those to see how the smoke might disperse from their project, but also, maybe more of a scientifically complex chemical transport model and doing something that's going to hopefully represent more of the chemistry and physics of different particles as they move away from a fire. So there's a lot of different moving pieces, but now I just get to sit in front of the computer and look at smoke.
Gotcha. So was there ever a fieldwork component? Were you ever out by the fires while they were happening at earlier stages in your career?
Not specifically by the fires. When I was doing my master's degree, I lived in Reno, Nevada, and I was there when the Rim Fire was going on. Not that it's there's a different fire every year. They all have a different name. So this was back in 2013. It was a while ago, but it was huge. It was in Yosemite National Park, and we just got blasted with smoke from that. So I did a lot of sampling up on the roof of our building during that and just living through the smoke in that fire, but I never specifically went to a fire area to do the work there.
And now that you're mostly focused on models, also, Becca and Caitlin, if you have questions that come up from Megan's answers, please feel free to jump in and ask those, because, it does not need to be just a back and forth between me and her. One of my YouTube rabbit holes lately, you'll be unsurprised to learn, is I've been watching a lot of VFX videos on how they actually do Hollywood special effects shots. And it seems like smoke simulation is actually pretty tough. And I imagine that modeling it for wildfires is pretty computationally intensive. So how heavy duty are these models? I imagine they've improved a lot as computer processing power has gotten faster. Can you tell us a little bit about that world?
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about it. Probably not as much as I should be able to.
What's the sort of part of this?
I should have boned up on this. Exactly. Maybe I should have read a few more papers just to make sure I was ready to go before this.
Sorry, we got sort of on the end of the name for a reason. It introduces the option for a lot of hand waving.
Let's just not tell my advisor about this interview, and everything's going to be fine. But yeah, it's a really tricky thing, because if you think about just a fire in general, it's a very complex process. There's only really 3 things you need for there to be a fire. It's fuel, oxygen, and heat. But getting the mixture of all of that changes how everything happens, how the fire burns, and then how smoke moves from that. So to try and represent it most accurately, you do need a lot of computing power, pretty much, is what seems to be the case. But there are a lot of people working on different areas of how to model this, thinking about, okay, how do we get this, how do we look at the plume rise, for example? How do we perfect knowing how tall the smoke will go from the fire, versus how can we better, use that computational power to get a good enough representation of the smoke. So there's kind of a balance there of getting it as right as we can, or getting it good enough.
There's that idea that no model is perfect, but they are useful.
Exactly. So there's a spectrum in there, and I've been just kind of looking at a lot of different pieces of that.
That's really cool. You also talk about your work really focuses on air quality. And I think a lot of the people who've been affected by these wildfires, yourself included, it becomes a very emotionally taxing sort of natural disaster to deal with, because even if you don't have to evacuate your home, it can still have a negative impact on your quality of life. I think we all remember the orange photos coming out of the Bay Area last summer. So how much of your work are you also thinking about air quality and the way that it affects people and society and the way we actually just live in a world that sometimes catches on fire?
I'm going to use that phrase sometime in the future. The world just sometimes catches on fire.
There's gender reveal parties all the time.
Oh my God.
Please don't do one. I know you won't, but don't.
Yeah, right. That's a note to you. Don't
The
do
fact
that.
that there's a body count on that type of party and it's consistent and new stories crop up all the time is just mind-boggling to me. So yeah, the human sort of the human element of the work you do, and like how air quality has impacts on like people. Like how does your science interface with society, I guess, which is sort of leading us into our sort of inclination to want to do outreach, which we'll talk about more in our second segment, but just sort of, yeah, people and fires and your air quality work.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the major kind of thread focus throughout my work that connects back to humans is kind of the health aspect, estimating what type of health impact there might be associated with that smoke. But I've also kind of tried to get a little bit into understanding a little bit more of the kind of the social side. I was able to do a survey of the public in North Carolina to try and figure out how they understand wildfire, prescribed fire, and smoke. See if they're even worried about certain things, if they trust the people performing prescribed fire, or if they're worried about wildfire smoke, if they would go somewhere else because of smoke. So it's not a super deep dive into kind of the more psychological aspects, but for an engineer to be able to do a survey like that has been pretty cool, to get a little bit more in touch with the people that are kind of on the other side of it. So
I'm sure Caitlin can speak to this as well, but like with my year of doing the Science Policy Fellowship with GSA, one of the themes that came up over and over again is it seems like there's increased awareness amongst natural scientists that and engineering, applied sciences as well, basically all kinds of science, that if you can get a social scientist on your grant, it's such a huge benefit to your ability to say that your research will actually have an impact, because you've got somebody who can study whether or not it actually has an impact. Just seems like that's been a huge trend recently, and I think one that's definitely to the benefit of the science.
Oh yeah.
So to sort of sum up things a little bit, Megan, I know we only barely scratched the surface of the work that you do, but if there was one sort of take-home message that you would want people to know about when it comes to wildfires, prescribed fires, and air quality, what would sort of be the one thing you'd want them to remember from this conversation we've had?
Like I said before, fire is very complex, and that also means that fire isn't necessarily bad. So I think that's one of the major things I want people to remember, is that I mean, I'm looking at some of the negative impacts of the smoke from these fires, and they're definitely negative impacts, but at the same time, having fire on the landscape is a really important thing. And so it's a very complex problem to approach. So try and keep yourself safe from smoke and from especially fire, but remember that hopefully the fire is going to do some good in the end.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great take-home message. Well, not to douse your research, but let's talk about water with Becca a little bit.
Nice pun.
Yeah.
So Becca, I'll kind of start with a similar question that I started with Megan in sort of what kinds of data are you interested? How do you collect those data? You know, are you running experiments? What's sort of the broad strokes of how you actually perform the research that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am also in a similar situation where I guess I've graduated to the point in my career, or as a fourth-year Ph.D. candidate, that I am predominantly, actually 99% of the time, in front of a computer these days, but have teams that I'm able to work with, and like, you know, previous Becca, former Becca, has collected data that I'm able to use. And one of the things that is most exciting to me about the soundscape aspect of my marine ecology research is that we get to just put an underwater microphone, which we call a hydrophone, out onto any site, put it underwater, and leave it there for however long the battery can handle. And so sometimes that means 6 months. So I just got 6 months worth of underwater sound data today. Came in the mail in a little external hard drive, and I ran an automatic detector on it. So, you know, a fancy algorithm that somebody else developed, and it goes through and pulls out every possible acoustic event, is what we call it, that might be an Atlantic cod vocalization. So a little sound from a fish. And so that's really what I'm looking at. I'm recording sound, listening for, in my case, I'm most interested in fish and shrimp. There are hundreds
Shrimp can
to
be very
thousands.
noisy.
Shrimp can be very noisy. There's snapping shrimp. They are near ubiquitous in the ocean, and they snap their claws so fast that they actually cavitate water. And so
You're gonna have
split
to tell
water.
us what that means.
I know, yeah. Sorry, split water molecules in half. So like the hydrogen and the oxygen in a water molecule separate and it forms an air bubble underwater. And then that bubble implodes on itself, creating a popping sound. And it is near constant, definitely in North Carolina, in lots of places in tropical, semi-tropical oceans. They're everywhere.
And is that where we get the term popcorn shrimp?
I wish, but no, I think that is from the sound of shrimp being placed in hot frying oil.
All right.
Or are they cavitating the frying oil?
I wish though. But yeah, so listening, acoustic data, so sound data from the oceans to ask questions about what animals, marine animals, are doing with their time.
So do people tend to assume that you're just like focused on shipping lanes and whale song?
Yes, definitely. And so I think my pitch or plea is to not forget about the fish, because because shipping lanes, like those noise effects, of course affect marine mammals, but also will affect the fish and other animals in that region.
And I think it's important to remember that the snapping shrimp are not the same as like the mantis shrimp. Mantis shrimps are not technically shrimps. They're a different type of crustacean. I often like to joke that the peacock mantis shrimp is one of the best animals that was named wrong 3 times. It's not a peacock, it's not a mantis, and it's not a shrimp. Like,
That's awesome.
Humans are not that original when it comes to naming things. Like, oh, that fish has stripes on it, tiger shark. All right, fine. Like, no,
Oh, I will name it after myself.
Exactly. Caitlin punching shrimp.
That's extremely common in fish.
Hey, I have my boxing gloves next to me in this closet, so
Oh, there you go.
you can bring it
Caitlin
out.
punching crustacean. Although that would suggest that it punches Caitlin's. I think Caitlin's like stellar sea cow. Caitlin's punching crustacean.
Yeah, Bergstrom's punching.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what kinds of questions are you asking about what's happening with the cod and the shrimp that can be answered by having 6 months of audio logs from the ocean? And I guess I also want to know a little bit more about like how you decide where and when to place your hydrophones in the ocean, because I hear the oceans are quite large.
They are quite large. It totally depends on the question you want to ask. And so my research is quite varied in that we've put hydrophones in different places. So one of my questions was, do artificial reefs, so like a ship that was intentionally sunk to create new habitat, does that have a different soundscape? Does it sound different there than it does at a natural reef? And we found that it does. There's like different frequency bands, so different sound levels that are different at each of these habitat types. And so there, we dropped a hydrophone directly on top of the ship structure, and that's kind of a discrete sampling point. But then one of my other projects, I'm more interested in, like, can we explain why those are different? Does it relate to different characteristics of the habitat? And so it's admittedly very expensive to go 20 miles offshore and put a hydrophone on 3 ships. And it's much cheaper to stay inshore where the water's only 6 feet deep. And so in a different project, we actually switched to looking at sampling seagrass beds and salt marsh creeks and oyster reefs, and measuring different traits of that habitat, and then putting hydrophones out and recording the sound in 24 different habitats and seeing, can we explain some of that variation? This is a very rambly answer, but then with the cod project, we're actually asking a totally different type of question, which is focusing in on a single species. And there we know that cod and most fish, when they're making sound, it's actually part of their mating ritual. So it's part of their mate attraction behaviors. And
how do they physically make the sounds? Because you told us, I mean, they're not cavitating water bubbles like these pistol
They're not. Yeah. No. So they're called sonic muscles. So there's lots of there's lots of fish that have swim bladders, or like a gas sac in their body, and they have these muscles that run along the swim bladder, and they're able to kind of contract those muscles and kind of beat the swim bladder like a drum is kind of one way.
Wow. But like an internal drum.
Yes. Or there's other ones where they can kind of manipulate their fin and move bone over other bone and make like a stridulation sound. Lots of different ways that. Yes. So many different ways Some of them are super cool, like booms and growls and purrs, and others are very pathetic little grunts. Cod tend to be a very pathetic sound. But yeah, so we put a hydrophone out where we think cod will be aggregating to reproduce, and specifically in the time period where we expect them to be spawning.
And is that like the North Atlantic? I think I just associate cod with like fish and chips in Iceland, so I'm thinking North Sea, North Atlantic.
This is off the coast of Massachusetts and Rhode Island.
Okay.
Gotcha. That project overlaps specifically with the wind energy area. So we're kind of getting at like natural ecosystem, human interactions there.
You may not know the answer to this. This is a random thought I had while you were talking, but I guess I always just assumed that whales have vocal cords. Like
I should
mammals?
know the answer to that. I am woefully uneducated on marine mammals.
It's okay. They're a very highly derived type of fish, so not a lot of pure fish people have spent much time with them.
But yes, I think they do. At least some do. Yes.
Yeah, I guess there's going to be a difference between the singing, your singing humpbacks versus your orca who's using the melon or whatever, the odontocetes and the mysocetes.
Exactly.
Do you have shrimp and cod sounds you could share with us to include in the recording?
Yes, certainly can. Yes.
Awesome. Okay, we will. So if you want to hear what the ubiquitous shrimp background noise sounds like, listen for that now. And then if you want to hear what horny cod sound like, now. Perfect. Thank you. And I guess, so Becca, now that we've heard those sounds, I should have asked, is it just the male cod? Is it, I guess I had a very heteronormative sense of the mating structure, that it would just be the males trying to attract the females, but that's
what is gender like in cod?
Yeah.
They have what is called a promiscuous lecking system. I just like that it says promiscuous, because it's not often that I get to like have fun with the fact that I effectively listen to fish sex sounds.
But I also do know what lecking is, but I'm gonna make
Ryan, your knowledge is vast.
Well, it's because you live in Wyoming and it's the sage grouse lecks, right? They do that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, but I will let you explain. So, I mean, you explain both promiscuous and lecking if you are so inclined.
So for the cod behavior, they all aggregate, males and females, in the general area, and the males form like these dense haystacks during the day, and then at night they kind of spread out in this region and each form their own territory and then kind of defend their small territory, and females are kind of in their own separate aggregation, and then the females will kind of enter into this territory and swim between all of the males, while the males make these grunts and kind of wave their fins, and the females will have the power of mate choice there to choose, which grunt is likely the deepest and the loudest, which would mean that fish is the biggest.
And how big do these fish get?
Oh, I should have a good answer to that. It's large. I wish I had better.
I'm thinking in a culinary perspective. I don't know if the cod that I'm getting here in DC are, the biggest that cod get, but like a single fillet from like one side of one animal is like 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds. Like it's a
very large fish. Yeah, and I wish, so this is actually revealing something that I need to do. There's, the major cod book, I think, is by Mark Kurlansky, detailing the history of the cod fishery. I think that cod are much
book, right?
Yes. Yeah. And cod are, I think, much smaller now than they used to be. So like you can't catch a cod as big as you could have in 1950. So they used to be like these massive, I'm going to throw 3 feet out there, but that's a little bit of that sort of estimate. But yes, they can be very large fish.
That is a book by Mark Kurlansky. I think he also wrote a book on like salt or something. He's written some interesting books that I've wanted to read. I will post a link to that book in the show notes, and it'll be an affiliate link for bookshop.org, which is an affiliate of Science Sort of. So thank you for bringing up a book that I can link to.
Absolutely.
In our discussion.
Becca, what made you want to, like, what part of you It's like, I want to know what the ocean sounds like. How do I do that? How did you get into your research?
That's a really good question. And honestly, it gives me an opportunity to talk about something I don't often get to, because what got me into it is not what I've been able to actually study. But what I learned was that, so many marine fish have this like 2-phase life cycle where adults will spawn, and then the, sperm and egg will fertilize, and that egg travels way offshore and circulates the ocean in some way. And then fish larvae swim back into shallow water and find habitat to settle at. And part of the way they find those like tiny little millimeters long fish larvae find their way back is by using a bunch of different sensory cues, one of which is sound. And so they can listen for the sound of habitat and find their way back. And I just was like flabbergasted by that. I think it's so incredible. And so all of like my interest on why different habitats sound different is actually motivated by if we can understand and potentially in the future test whether fish would choose a different habitat, or like are listening for a habitat to get to some ultimate habitat type that they know is a good fit for them.
Whoa. That's pretty cool.
Thank you. I think it's incredible. So it's always fun to hear people get excited about it too.
Definitely. So to sort of wrap things up a little bit, and obviously there's way more we could talk about, you kind of told us that artificial reefs sound different. What are maybe some of the implications of that? Because I tend to see people, conservationists included, promoting artificial reefs as like this great solution to the fact that we're acidifying the oceans and killing all of our reefs, but to me it always felt like we're kind of just finding a new place to dump our trash. And so just any thoughts on what a different sounding reef actually means in terms of the ecology of the ocean, and then what was sort of the take-home message from listening in on the cod mating and how they go about their life cycle, their
Absolutely.
lecking.
Yeah. So as for like what a different soundscape on an artificial reef means, I think that we don't know. We'd have to see how fish or other marine animals would respond to those different sounds to really know what it means. It could have an effect on what fish choose to use that habitat. But yeah, you bring up a really important point that artificial reefs can be really great in replacing degraded habitat, providing new habitat. They also create fishing hotspots, which can be great for local economies, can be not so great for the actual ecosystems. And so I think they are certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution to any of our problems, but when used well, can be an effective part of ocean management. As for cod, I think what we've learned is that it seems like cod in our study region, so southern New England, spawn at a slightly different time than cod in other regions. And so we have found 2 places off the coast of Massachusetts where they are spawning, and it does overlap with planned offshore wind energy. And so our project is still ongoing, but the goal of that is to really nail down and potentially even be able to predict when and where the cod are going to be spawning in this region, and see if we can work with the wind energy developers to mitigate any potential impacts.
That's really interesting. I have one last question. If you don't know the answer, that's fine. Just say so and we'll cut it. I know with a lot of seafood, like cod is clearly this important economic species. It has been for centuries. Is this one of those species where like if you go to the store and try to buy cod, you might not be buying the thing you think you're buying? Or like are there different types of cod that can be kind of confused for one another? Or sort of what does it mean for humans who like fish and chips like myself?
Absolutely. I know a little bit, but I think that anyone who is interested in making sure they're making sustainable seafood choices to back me up and do more of their own reading on this. But yes, so you could buy what is labeled as a Pacific cod, and it could be Atlantic cod, and that is generally not a good thing.
Okay.
I think Pacific cod are doing much better than Atlantic cod. Most often, I think they're also coming from European countries in the Atlantic Ocean, and cod stocks are doing much better there than they are off the northeast Atlantic coast. So yeah, it definitely, location matters, fishing style matters. It does.
Okay, so It's complicated, and people should look into it and figure it out for themselves. But one place you might go to have fish and chips, if you were allowed to, would be the pub, where you might also have a drink, which is what we're going to talk about in our next segment. Coming up next, that's called What Are We Drinking? It would not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also talk about what we are drinking. And unfortunately, Caitlin and I have had the chance to actually hang out in person, but even though we were supposed to all get to come together for orientation and have like a fun time at AGU's headquarters, they have a new building, I don't know if you heard, and maybe go out for a drink afterwards, we weren't able to do that. So we're gonna have to recreate that here in the virtual environment by me asking all of y'all, what are you drinking? Megan, let's keep the order consistent and I'll just bug you first.
Sure, yeah. So I'm drinking a left-hand milk stout.
Good choice.
But it's a chai milk stout.
Ooh.
So it's got a little extra, like, it doesn't affect the flavor a whole lot, but it just smells really nice. And it's super smooth.
And you're still out in Colorado? Okay,
Yeah,
because they're in Longmont? Yeah. I like Left Hand a lot. That was probably the first milk stout that I came across in regular distribution, and it's real good.
Mm-hmm. It is. It's my standard for a milk stout, for sure.
Very cool.
And it's like, it's a little weird to be drinking it in April because I would be a little more wintry, I would suppose, but it's been kind of like a gloomy day, so it felt
I got
right.
a pretty dark, robust beer to pair with you. So once we get around to me, I'll team up with you. But Becca, what about you?
I had grand intentions of making myself a gin and tonic, and then decided to make dinner instead, and ended up with a nice glass of chilled white wine. Which, the only thing interesting about it is that I can't tell you anything about the wine because I don't remember, but we got it in one of our COVID, splurges, treat yourself moments, was to get, like a wine subscription box. And so we just did like the quick trial when you get super discounted wines. And we got like 15 bottles of wine for $80. And so It's been very enjoyable to just be able to grab a bottle of wine without thinking about it. So that is what I have. I think it's a Pinot Grigio.
Is it white wine a go-to beverage for you, or is that
just with? I follow the temperature with drinking wine, so very much a red wine in the winter, white wine in the summer type wine girl.
Feel that, yeah.
Well, Caitlin, what about you?
I am drinking a Lakefront Brewery Juicify IPA. I went to college in Wisconsin, and this is a Milwaukee brewery. So I was very surprised to find it at the liquor store in DC. So I was excited to grab it, but it's quite good. Very orange.
It's like a hazy IPA or what?
I left it in the bottle. I can't remember if it's hazy or not, but I think it is. Yeah.
I've oft lamented that is the style that seems to be taking over. But as a guy who started drinking IPAs on the West Coast, it appreciates the West Coast filtration IPA. But that's okay.
Yeah, I understand.
I only like the hazy IPAs.
Becca, can you do a study that determines if there's different sound effect? Like, is the sound through a hazy IPA different than the sound through a filtered IPA?
I bet it is. I bet sound does travel differently through them.
I would not be surprised just with the particulate matter.
Yeah,
alone.
definitely.
Yeah.
Well, because I got paired with the North Carolina cohort, I decided to have a beer that was themed after a fossil that is easy to find in North Carolina. I'm having a Megalodon Imperial Coffee Porter.
Nice.
And this is from Champion Brewing Company, which I believe is in Virginia. I get them. I drink Charlottesville, Virginia. Yeah. And this is a beer my buddy Abe gave to me. Abe's on the show often. So it's an Imperial Porter brewed with coffee. So since we were kind of doing a little bit earlier in the day recording, not inappropriately early to be enjoying a beer, but enough that, a little bit of coffee wasn't going to hurt me. It's real good. It's, like I said, robust, roasty, toasty, good porter flavor with strong notes of coffee and Megalodon.
Roasty toasty.
This might be more for our science segment, but I have actually been on a dive with people in North Carolina when they come up with Megalodon teeth.
Oh, that's awesome.
So that's like
from a living megalodon or one of the extinct ones?
Well, yes. I mean, megalodon are certainly still alive, obviously.
No, they're not. Don't confuse the people.
I'm sorry. Megalodon are very much extinct. It was extinct. I thought you set me up for the joke, so I went with it. But yes, so very much an extinct one, but lots of good teeth. And the going rate, if you want to sell them here, is pretty nice.
So all you have to do is be able to dive.
Yes.
No, you can find megalodon teeth. And it's funny, we were talking about this on an earlier episode. It's like there's almost no animal, either living or extinct, that you refer to by just the species name, which is the case with megalodon. It's like one of the few instances where that has happened. So it's Carcharodon or Carcharias megalodon, depending on, there's some stuff happening with what genus and maybe even what family megalodon is supposed to be in. But it's funny because, like, if you look at, there's a genus named Megalodon, and it's like a giant clam from the Jurassic. It's like a completely different non-intense thing. So it's funny that Megalodon has achieved this status that no other extinct being has. But you can find Megalodon teeth on the beach in like Virginia and Maryland along the Chesapeake, Calvert Cliffs area. Calvert Cliffs can get pretty picked over, but if you can get onto some of the private beaches, or if you know people who will tell you where the secret creek beds are, where they wash out of the creek bed, that is a helpful thing. So, Caitlin, if you ever want to go a little fossil hunting trip,
oh yeah, I could
make that happen. Yeah, so that's what I'm having. Do we have any idea what Megalodon would have sounded like, Becca? Because it doesn't. We know it's a shark, so it doesn't have a swim bladder.
Right. I don't think so. Sharks can definitely hear, but I don't think they make too much sound. So I think its sound contribution would be from chomping bones.
Well, if only we could elect them to Congress. Am I right? Let's talk about policy. In our next segment, where we'll be talking all about the Voices for Science program, not the Voices for Sharks, the Voices for Science, and that's coming up next. So for our second segment of the show, we wanted to talk a little bit more about the Voices for Science program, which is the reason that the four of us have all gotten to know each other over the past year. So, Caitlin, I know you gave us a little bit of an introduction to the program, but now that we're talking about this for the segment, can you give us a little bit of an introduction of yourself and your role at AGU and your background and how you got here, and sort of just let the people know who you are and why you're in charge of, wrangling us for the past year?
Who did that? So my name's Caitlin. I am the policy analyst for our Science Policy and Government Relations team at AGU. So AGU is a scientific society. We have more than 130,000 scientists and enthusiasts worldwide that love the earth and space sciences. We have a very large member base in the US. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. Have you heard about our new building? It's net zero energy. So like I said, we very green. We started building this program in 2017 as a response to a lot of the sort of anti-science rhetoric that was happening both with the public and within the administration in the US. There was a lot of not so favorable stuff happening with scientists. There was a lot of research that was being suppressed within the administration. Scientists were leaving agencies in record numbers. So our policy department at AGU gives lots of resources to scientists to help them talk to their policymakers, build relationships with them. But we were noticing that there weren't a lot of people that were engaging on their own, but we knew that people were interested in it. So we started this program where folks like everyone here who are interested in science policy, want to get more involved, apply. They're part of this 12-month program. We do a kickoff workshop where we sort of teach them the basics of science communication and science policy. And then in non-COVID times, we would have everyone come to Washington, D.C. We set up meetings with our members of Congress. We all got to romp around Capitol Hill, see some Congress people, do good people watching, maybe go to the Library of Congress, and really start to kick off those relationships with our policymakers. this cohort got to experience a very fun year for this program where we shifted basically everything to online engagement. So it's been a pretty different way of doing things, but the goal of our program of having this dedicated group. So Ryan said before, we have 2 tracks. So there's a policy track and sort of a media communications track. We are the policy folks who are trying to get more science into legislation and policy. So the goal of this is just to give a smaller group of people sort of more attention, more tools, accountability within a smaller group of people to really do that relationship building and that outreach around science and policy. So it's a more like dedicated grassroots program. So I think those are the voices questions. I realize I didn't even talk about myself, but
yeah, I was going to say, but you told us you're a policy analyst, but you didn't tell us what that means.
I don't even know if I know what that means sometimes. So my background is in science as well. So I studied environmental science and biology. I did my thesis in an entomology lab. So I worked on looking at how fire suppression or different fire management techniques in prairies in Wisconsin affected insect biodiversity. So the lab that I worked in was doing a lot of sort of sustainable agriculture around insects. So I got pretty tired of spending all of my summers on my feet in a field and took some policy classes while I was in school, decided that policy was something that I wanted to do. So I built this plan as a 20-year-old that I would move to DC when I graduated from college and work in policy and then go back and get a master's degree and then come back to DC and do science policy. So it took kind of a roundabout way of getting there. I did move to DC. I interned with the Obama White House doing some environmental policy there, got a job at a consulting firm doing work with different federal agencies. So I helped do some environmental regulations with the EPA. I did some work with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So it sounds like a lot of stuff that Becca would be familiar with, and sort of didn't like how much policy I was doing, wanted to do more science, and came to AGU about 2 years ago. So my role on the team at AGU is doing a lot of sort of digital engagement. So this year has been a good time for me in that.
So you say that you mostly do a lot of digital stuff, which has certainly been the case this year. But when I was doing the first half of my science policy fellowship before the world ended, I would go to like House and Senate hearings. And if AGU was helping coordinate one of the witnesses at those hearings, I would sometimes see you sitting just behind the witness in your official capacity. So what are you doing there? Like, I'm not that you shouldn't be there, but like, what is your role in that situation?
So a lot of what our work as a team is just to help scientists better communicate their work with the public and with policymakers. So it's happened a few times where we have, I think the hearing that you're talking about is actually another Voices for Science alum who is a professor in Colorado who was the lead author of the IPCC cryosphere report. She is a cryosphere scientist named Heidi Stelzer. So she got asked by the committee to testify on a hearing of the impacts of climate change. So she wrote testimony out to talk about why cryosphere research was relevant to climate change and what some policy things that could be done with that. So I edited her testimony for her and sort of sat behind her in case she got any questions that were too difficult. She actually told me afterwards that she wishes I would have passed her more notes just to be more encouraging, but she was very nervous. But because I was right behind her, I also ended up on like the full hearing recording. So I'm in like a very nice orange blazer, not subtle at all.
Whereas there are maybe moments in that hearing, if you scan the back row, you might see me typing furiously on my laptop, hiding from the cameras as best I can. I started to learn where the camera angles were so I could hide effectively.
I think in a normal, if I were just sitting listening to a hearing, which we definitely do as well, I would not sit directly behind the witnesses, but because I needed to be ready to tell her, you don't have to answer that question, or it's okay to say that you don't know the answer to that question and that you'll follow up later. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I needed to be a little bit more on the ready and available. There were a couple of other similar public affairs, government relations handlers that were also next to me that were doing the same kind of thing. I think that I enjoy this role so much at AGU because I do have the science background. I was in academia for a while. I came out of academia. I worked for the federal government and now working with Congress more. It's sort of like all of the pieces come together. So Congress is not a thing that we ever were really taught in school. Everything that I have learned, I've learned on the job. So the way that Congress works, the way that you call witnesses, the way that you write bills, how you actually can influence a member of Congress as a constituent. That was all stuff that I learned in this job. And that's why there's people in DC who do government relations work. It's very much a skill to know sort of the insides of how Washington works. Mm-hmm. So
or does it? Am I
right? I mean, so we want our scientists to be active constituents because all of the research that you guys are doing is really important. It matters to your lawmakers. It matters in your communities, but there is this really big disconnect to sort of like what you're saying with the social scientists on our projects earlier. There's a huge disconnect between the actual research that you're doing and applying it to the real world. So our work is just helping sort of bridge that gap in any way that we can. So our team has some people who have science backgrounds, some law backgrounds, some strict policy backgrounds. So I think it really helps us engage with all the stakeholders that are involved in a way that creates sort of a meaningful end product. So I think I called myself Heidi Struppa on Capitol Hill. I was like, I'll tell you where to go. I'll tell you who to talk to. I'll tell you what to say.
Well, it's so funny. You know, my experience, I started sort of my policy journey, if you will, by signing up for one of these geoscience congressional visit days, which is a day where organizations like AGU, GSA, AGI, SSA, all these 3-letter acronym geoscience agencies bring geoscientists, specific kind of folks, geoscience folks, to DC. There's a day of training where there's some explanation of how Congress works. There's some explanation of the budget process. And then there's a little bit of like practicing how to have one of these meetings with your legislative staff office. And then, you know, you're kind of just thrown into the deep end. Like you put on a suit, which most scientists are not super comfortable wearing. And you run around these halls of power and you try to have these short little 15-20-minute meetings. And it was really learned by doing. And then I was lucky enough to get the GSA Science Policy Fellowship. And within a week of getting that job, it was that year's Geoscience CVD again. And I had to be the policy person. I had to be the guy that was like being like, well, I know where to go. And, you know, like, let's hope I don't get lost because I took the wrong stairwell of Rayburn. And, you know, it's, it really is sort of, as they say in the West Wing, to use a West Wing quote, which I think is appropriate here. It's like, we play with live ammo. Like you learn by really doing it. You got to get out there and just try, which transitions me nicely, I think, to asking Megan and Becca, what encouraged the two of you to want to sign up for the Voices for Science program? Like, what was the sort of the impetus there behind your application? Becca's pointing at you, Megan, so I think it is on you to go first.
Well, yeah, through all of the different science things I've done, I mean, I've taken a really windy path through science to get where I am. I've worked between all my degrees, and I've definitely along the way learned a lot of things I don't like about the jobs or research I've done. But the one thing I really learned that I liked was communicating science to other people, whether it was like going into classrooms or talking to even just my coworkers about something else that I had been doing in the lab and helping them understand how to do the process. I just realized that I really liked telling other people about science. And so when I learned about this program and specifically that, you know, there was this policy specific track to it, I was really excited about it because thinking about talking to a policymaker, I mean, it still kind of makes me a little bit nervous, but like at the beginning of this program, that's something I wouldn't have probably done by myself. You know, I like to talk to people, but I still would have been pretty nervous ahead of time. And I wouldn't have known, you know, really what to do beforehand. I probably could have done research, like, you know, I probably could have found some of the resources that AGU has, but, you know, I'd still be kind of starting from scratch in terms of how I even approached the thing. So knowing that there was a program where there are people dedicated to helping you do this type of outreach and kind of helping you keep accountable as well, like giving you this goal to try and do something every month. I was really excited about that. So I wanted to be able to improve my confidence and be able to say that I would be comfortable meeting with a policymaker to talk about my science or somebody else's science and why it's important.
All right, Becca, no more pointing. You're up.
I wasn't trying to evade, but yeah. So I have, so in undergrad, I learned the term like applied research, where you're like asking a research question that has some specific application, that you're trying to answer a question that benefits someone or something. And that really hit home with me. I really liked that idea of using science to answer questions to have a positive effect on society, or in my case, more specifically, often the environment. And so learning more about applied research led me to science policy. I don't think I really heard that term until grad school. And I was like, I read some things and kind of was trying to follow what science policy really meant. And I could never really get a full grasp of like what science policy was. And like, I knew I wanted to advocate for science and advocate evidence-based policies, especially when it comes to like conservation or management. But I didn't know how to get involved, and I didn't know how the mechanics of that actually worked. And what I'm learning is that it's on the job. You learn on the job, like you guys both just talked about. But I found AGU Voices for Science as a way to actually learn more about what this science policy space looks like, and really kind of jump into it and stop just learning about science policy and instead be a scientist who's actively engaging in the science policy space.
So what do we all think? I mean, it's been a year. I'll speak for myself a little bit, I guess. My reason for signing up for the Voices for Science program, I said this in my interview with Liz, and this interview was like February 2020. It was, there was some talk of a virus coming out of China that might disrupt some things for a little bit. And so I remember I'm standing in my office at the AAAS building where GSA has their policy offices here in DC. And I remember saying, and I meant this, and it's become a little bit of my like mantra throughout this whole year, which has been really unfortunate, of like, I wanted to do Voice for Science because so much of my science outreach is virtual. I'm on Twitter. I'm doing a podcast. I'm doing these things that like I believe have an impact, but it's a very wide and diffuse impact. And I because I'd gotten better at doing these in-person things in DC, I was taking scientists on visits around the Capitol. I was getting the meetings with their legislatures. I was really feeling good about like the in-person stuff I'd been able to figure out how to do. And I said I wanted to push myself to do more in-person types of science outreach. And then I got accepted in the 2020 cohort, and then I was not allowed to do in-person things at all for a year. So joke's on me. So I know this was like far and away not the normal year for Voices for Science or for anybody, but Caitlin, what were some of the things we were supposed to be doing, or what were sort of some of the outcomes that AGU is looking for, and how did we do? How was this year for all of us?
So the main thing I think that was taken away from you all is actually coming to DC and doing the Capitol Hill visits, and for all of us to meet. It feels very strange that I've only met Ryan, but I think that's probably the biggest thing, because like we've talked about, it really is a very whirlwind experience going through all of the meetings. But it's amazing how quickly everyone sort of gets in a groove when they're in the meeting. So you start the first couple of meetings. We usually go on, I think the three of us or the four of us would have gone on 10 meetings or so. So it's a lot. It's quite a lot to schedule. It's a lot of people to talk to. You get to see all various different kinds of meetings that you'll take. Some of them are really quick. Some people are very short. Some people will ask you a lot of questions that you don't expect to be asked a lot of questions of. So missing that is disappointing, but I think a lot of the rest of the program is sort of asking people to do things out in their community. So I think Becca has been a very good example of this, doing a lot of the science policy outreach with other folks at UNC. I think doing all of your involvement in science debate was a really good time to do this too. So a lot of that is already kind of digital involvement, but we don't really have specific outcome goals for individuals in the program. I think we just want everyone to be more comfortable taking these actions unprompted. So they see a piece of legislation that is good for science or bad for science, and they can just contact their member of Congress and say, hey, representative, this legislation is great. Thank you so much for sponsoring it, or please sign on to this bill, or don't sign on to this bill. So I think those aspects of it were not lost, but I think it did force a lot of people to get really creative in what it meant to do outreach. So some of my other participants ended up forming coalitions within their cities that included city public health officials, other scientists that were doing air quality alongside them. I had one of my other folks who lives in a very rural community, her recycling program stopped in her town, and she could not figure out why, and went to a town hall meeting and found the right people to talk to and found out the reason why, and is now very involved with the county council to try to figure out how to get this other issue resolved. So it's not just talking to members of Congress. It's sort of like, what are ways that we can get all of you to use your great skills as scientists, use your skills as researchers to get more involved in the policy aspect of your communities.
And so what are, Megan, what are some things that you did as part of your, like, maybe one of your top, like, because we all had to fill out the survey of, like, the things we were most proud of. So what did you list as the thing you're most proud of, or the thing that was the most impactful? Because Becca's like an editor of a journal now, so she's just blown us out.
I have not gotten that position.
Dude,
Let's
I know.
not overstate this.
Becca ran her own workshop for science policy.
Becca ran her own workshop, which was my best moment as a Voices for Science person, was participating in Becca's workshop.
I think we can all agree that Becca basically shaped our Voices for Science experiences.
I just can't say no. It's the problem.
Megan, what does it feel like to have been second and third fiddle for an entire year?
You know, it's
none of you are that.
I'm not okay with this.
I'm like the mom. I'm like, I love all my children equally.
Mama Caitlin loves me. Yay.
Well, since it came up and Megan and I did both participate, so like Becca, you put together a workshop. Like, can you tell us a little bit about this workshop?
Sure. This is bad, but so Ryan, I was going to say which one, but that's really bad.
Well, yeah, look at the time. I think we're just about out of time here for.
Okay, I'll bring it back in. So, one, I think Voices for Science for me came in a really perfect time where it opened so many doors just because I was willing to say yes to things. And so, like, what I have done, none of it was a single effort. All of it was collaborative. But that being said, myself as a member of UNC Chapel Hill Science Policy Advocacy Group hosted workshops where we would help bring in other experts and train graduate students most specifically on how to communicate their science. So what is effective communication? And we were really grateful to be able to use the tools and even PowerPoint slides that AGU's science policy team developed. So definitely could not have pulled this off without AGU and Voices for Science specifically. A member of our former cohort, David Gorlick, is actually my co-president for UNC Science Policy Advocacy Group. And so, yeah, we had this training workshop. It was like a 30-minute how to communicate. And then we brought in science policy experts, which I will say, Ryan, you were brought in as an expert on someone who knows how to do this and you know, has a proven track record of communicating to their elected officials. And with that,
it's basically, you basically asked me to play a Whose Line Is It Anyway game where I have to pretend to be a Democrat staffer for 15 minutes or a Republican staffer for 15 minutes.
We did indeed do that.
It's fun.
We did indeed.
It's fun.
It was.
It's great.
That's how we
I loved
learned.
it.
I hope you guys liked it. Yeah, we had basically mock meetings. So the opportunity we weren't able to actually get in DC, we tried to recreate that in a very low stress environment for our workshop attendees, so they could get a taste of what it was like, and then hopefully be able to go and do that on their own in the future.
Yeah, Megan, what was your experience like in that sense?
Well, just on the mock, meeting type thing, I really appreciated that from our little, our intro week, because it was like a low pressure way to figure out, okay, what is
you reminded me about that, because I didn't put this in my survey, and obviously I probably wouldn't have even if I had remembered. But do you guys remember that Elizabeth didn't think that I was supposed to be participating and ignored me the entire time?
Yes.
She's like, I know you, Ryan. You don't need to practice. Straight up would not talk to me the entire time.
And then just took us through the ringer.
That helped so bad, but I had not a single opening. I don't know if that was recorded. If there's a recording of it, I want the tapes, because there was no time in between her grilling of you and me not having a chance to jump in and help.
I forgot that this happened because I was not in this room, because I was with my other group, because I was like, Ryan knows what he's doing. He can handle these mock visits. So these really are, I think, I'm glad that we do them now. I think that is another benefit of the pandemic is we've done mock visits in our workshop in the past, but I think there's something very different about being in a Zoom room that feels much higher stakes than if you're just sitting with other people. So we did this in the last workshop, and we have this really great outside lobbyist that works with AGU who's been in the biz for many, many years. And my newest cohort, my new group, the new U's, were absolutely grilled by this lobbyist. And she asked them very specific questions, but they handled it great. I mean, it really is the best. It's like such a good way to sort of just get all of your nervous energy out there, and then you're set for a meeting.
Trial by fire.
Definitely.
Trial by fire in a Zoom room.
You feel it, though. You feel the pressure.
Yes.
Well, and they really, I mean, that's so useful, because Megan and I were in the same group in this year's Geosciences Congressional Visits Day, and we got very similar questions as we did in that mock meeting, of like really drilling down to like why the money needs to come from the federal government. And so we actually got a first attempt at that question before having an actual meeting with our senator's office, maybe a representative's office. But yeah, so it's super useful.
Definitely. Yeah. And that was, I mean, for me, those geoscience congressional visits that we put together in our little group, we had a group of 4 of us from North Carolina, all grad students. It was great. But that was, I think for me, that was the highlight of this year, because that was one of my major goals, was to have these meetings with our policymakers to talk about science and specific policy that was important to us. And it was I was really glad to have those mock meetings ahead of time, because like you said, we were ready. I felt really good in those meetings. I thought we did really well. I mean, I don't know how much, they were going to act on what we had said, but I thought we handled it really well. I felt really good about what we did. And I felt really proud of myself. It was a very stressful month for me otherwise, but I was not super stressed about these meetings because we were ready.
Well, I think I need to be meaner in mock visits now. I think that's what I've learned, is I need to go harder.
I was definitely, it's hard for me because I definitely, when I was invited to participate in Becca's workshop, I was pretty standoffish in those meetings, because I've been in meetings, and this is an apolitical statement, both sides of the aisles, where the staffer you're talking to is very standoffish or even borderline aggressive, or just does not care. And they might not care because they agree with you, and they think you showing up to a meeting for them to agree with you is a waste of time. So that's why it's an apolitical statement, because it legitimately doesn't matter if they're on your side or not. They can still be really standoffish and borderline rude. And so it was so hard for me to hold it together in the mock meetings, and then I was just like a hawk watching the timer tick down and be like, okay, so we got 2 minutes. You guys were wonderful. You did such a good job. I'm so sorry. I had to I had to race through my please don't think I'm a mean person. I was just playing a role.
But I mean, I think you're totally right. I feel like I think I think a lot of the intimidation of meeting with members of Congress is people are afraid if they have, they're afraid that they're not going to be able to explain their research in a way that other people will understand, which is like what I and AGU and lots of other people are here for. So that part you can handle. I think people are really afraid that their meeting might be hostile. And I have never been in a meeting where a senator's staffer is like, I don't believe in climate change, so why are you even here? That doesn't really happen as often as going to an office where they do agree with you on a lot of issues and they're like, we get it, so why are you here? Like the senator agrees with all of these things, they've signed on to all of these bills, what can you give to me? It's very, things in Washington are very transactional, so it's a thing that people need to be prepared for. But yeah, but I'm glad that those are helpful and that you all feel prepared. But I mean, the good thing about this too is now you've met with both senators and representative. Ryan and I don't have those.
I've never felt more put on, I don't even know if put on blast is the right term here, but like made to feel like how transactional it can be, Caitlin, is, business cards are still a thing in DC. You exchange them at every meeting, whether you need to or not. It's very silly. Yeah, Caitlin and I both have ours very handy. I have so many from GSA because they gave me a year's worth and I only needed 6 months worth. So
I had some made before this and I didn't get to use them.
So
sad.
But I literally had meetings where, it was 3 of us and then like a staffer or 2, and you do all the exchange of business cards. And then the staffer literally just like put the business cards in front of themselves in the angle that we were sitting at them at, so that they didn't even have to pretend to remember our name. They could just look at the business card and then look up and speak to us. And I was like, wow, this is literally like Pokemon cards to you. Like, you do not care. You're just collecting them all. And it's okay, fair enough. Like, yeah, I'm just sad, Megan and Becca, that you guys never got to do a walk and talk, because there's something, it actually does happen, and they are fun.
They are fun. There's a lot of lobbying stuff that is fun and not slimy.
And Caitlin, are you a registered lobbyist? Like, are you one of the big scary lobbyists that we always hear about?
No, I'm not, but we do have registered lobbyists on our team. It's something like it needs to be a certain percentage of your time, and I do more grassroots lobbying, which is different. So my job is telling other people how to talk to members of Congress, and that's grassroots lobbying, as opposed to me just going to Congress and talking to them about the thing that I would like them to do.
Right. There's like a very subtle distinction between lobbying and advocacy.
Yes, they are. It's a subtle distinction, but they are different things. Yeah, I'm an advocacy person, not a lobbyist. We do have lobbyists. I lobby on occasion. You're allowed to lobby and not be a lobbyist. But not all lobbyists are bad. I think that's an important takeaway of this talk, too. Lobbying isn't always a bad thing.
One of the groups I ended up working with for the Voices for Science cohort, it was like a sort of a coalition of people who had similar interests. And they were talking about, they kept saying like, well, how do we best lobby this to our representatives or our senators? And I had to like, I was like, I got to reframe you slightly there, because like, if you are a constituent, you cannot be lobbying. You are just expressing your rights as a constituent who is being represented by this person. So like, I know the distinction might seem completely pointless to the person I'm speaking to, but the distinction is not pointless to the staffer or the representative that you'll end up eventually communicating with. So
yeah, good point.
So Megan and Becca, even though you didn't get to come to DC and hang out with Caitlin and I, someday, and we can even record another podcast in person at Archipelago or something. And how has this last year of pushing ourselves to all do these different kinds of policy outreach type activities changed your perspective, or like, where do we go from here? What's your sort of takeaway from this whole last year?
It's got me excited to just keep going with this stuff. I think I've spent a lot of time, especially this year, doing more planning for kind of longer term actions than actually doing some actions. But it's got me thinking about what I can be doing in the future and how to incorporate that more into what I want to be doing as I finish up grad school and go somewhere else, And I think one of my goals this year that I didn't get to do as much was to work with students within my own department to get them more excited about this type of communication. But I will say I got really excited that I was able to at least inspire a friend to apply to the program and get involved. And there's another student from our department who also, applied and got accepted to the next cohort, and they're really excited. So I'm looking forward to starting our own little NC State group, alumni group going forward and working together with them. So I'm just kind of jazzed on doing some more science policy and communication.
And unfortunately, I think fire policy is going to be with us for a little while now.
Just a little bit, yeah. But I got some exciting ideas about that too, so hopefully I can talk to you guys for things in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Well, how about you, Becca?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a huge question. I feel like this year, despite its challenges, definitely had some silver linings in like being able to connect with more people because of it being virtual. Like you just weren't limited by geography. And so I think that was my most exciting thing in being so heavily involved with a university science policy group. We were able to connect with people from honestly across the country, but definitely across North Carolina, and get more graduate student scientists engaged in thinking about communication and policy. And so that was extremely rewarding for me. And I think what I have really gained from this is just like more confidence in moving forward in this space, like Megan was saying, in that like, even if I don't feel fully prepared, to just go ahead and say yes to some opportunity. And I feel like I have a network now of people that I can reach out to and be like, hey, this came across my plate. How do I move forward with this? Like, are there weird little things I need to know about? And like, I can email you guys and figure that out. Yeah. And just, I mean, keep moving forward. I think that science policy is definitely the route I want to go post grad school, more so than academia. And so I think that this year has been really invaluable in kind of setting forward on that path.
Considering you've started looking up neighborhoods when Caitlin and I mentioned them are in DC, I was like, yeah, I kind of think we might have gotten our hooks into Becca a little bit.
Yes, I want to move to DC so bad. It's bad. I even
be our neighbor.
Please, yes, I will be letting you know when those days come. But no, like I wasn't even that interested in like the congressional side of it. And this now has really like, ooh, Congress means drama, and that sounds fun.
Yeah. honestly, that's how I really feel. Like I think living or like working in the agency side of things in DC for a long time, I was like, yeah, this is fine. Policy is okay, but it is really fun to be like, did you see the bill that the senator introduced? Did you see what someone said on the floor? And it only matters to a very small group of people, but it's fun.
So many of the notes I had to take while I was sitting in these Senate and House hearings, a lot of it was like, obviously there's a record of what's been said in all these meetings, and if they have to vote on anything, there's a recordation of the votes, and they're all live streams. So you don't have to be in the room, but when you're in the room and you can just get the vibe of a person, and so I can just, if in my notes, I'm just be like, Lucas actually seems on board with this, or it's like, you know what, Murkowski's not feeling it. I can tell. Like it's, and it's just a lot of those little subtle things of just being in the room where it happens, as Lin-Manuel put it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is hard to do virtually. I did go to a number of virtual hearings while I was still doing the policy fellowship, and it was it's not quite the same. Well, any final thoughts as we kind of wrap up here? Megan and Becca, you both are getting ready to finish up degrees and move on to next steps, but do you have anything like exciting that you want people to know about happening in your lives now? Any cool papers coming down the pike or anything like that?
Papers.
Oh God.
I mean, I'm working on papers. I don't know if I want to tell you about them yet, but
That's fair. Well, you're always welcome to come back on the show when those papers are ready to be talked about. We have a open invitation policy to all former guests of the show to come back on and follow up on things, because we want to break that sort of cycle of science being a thing that just gets reported on once. Like it's a process. Things change, updates happen. Any cool outreach efforts that you want people to know about, or things that they can get involved with in the North Carolina area that you want them to just be aware of? it's fine if not. I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything off the top of my head. How about you, Becca?
I mean, North Carolina area, maybe not. I mean, North Carolina Science Fest is the whole month of April, I think, and there's a lot of really cool virtual programming happening. And that's annual. So even if we miss it this year, there are a lot of really cool grassroots science outreach activities in North Carolina if you're in this area.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And then Caitlin, any parting thoughts or words of wisdom from somebody who's been in the trenches a lot longer than us and will stay there long after we've evacuated?
Oh boy. I hope I have the stomach for it. No, I mean, I think I'm very grateful for people like you all who want to get more involved in this kind of work. And I hope that some of our scientist listeners feel inspired to do more of this work, or people who like science and want more science in legislation. We're happy to help all kinds of science. I don't really know a lot about like physics or math or engineering, but lots of different kind of earth sciences. I'm happy to help translate anything. But there are also a lot of other people like me. If you are a scientist and you're part of an association, there's somebody like me. There's a million of me at all of these different associations.
Yep.
So you can always find people who will help you.
Absolutely. So if scientists are interested in applying for either the communications track or the policy track of a future Voices for Science cohort, I will include the link to that in the show notes for this episode. It basically just means a commitment to doing one outreach activity a month and then having a conversation with cool people about what you've done that past month. Like that really is what it comes down to. You might even get free meeting registration if the meeting isn't canceled by a global pandemic. And
the applications will open in December, and the year is April to April, which is kind of an odd time, but that's just the way things work. But we'll have lots of other engagement opportunities. We'll have virtual advocacy days for scientists to get involved and talk to their members of Capitol Hill coming up in the summer. So follow us on Twitter, Sci Policy at AGU. AGU SciPol is our handle.
And we will link to that in the show notes just to make sure we get it right. And one final thing I want to reiterate a point Caitlin just made, because I think it's a really important point, and it was one of the points I felt like I had to make over and over again during my year as a science policy fellow. And it's that if you belong to a professional scientific society, or if you're just at a university, there's probably policy people who are in DC working on your behalf, either your university's behalf or your professional society's behalf. And you may feel silly reaching out to them in sort of a cold calling, I've never done this before, but I would like to get more involved sort of way. But I can guarantee if I was the one still in charge of that email inbox, it would be the best email I received that day. If somebody
love it.
Yes.
It
if somebody
makes
just
my
said,
day.
help me do some science policy outreach. I want to get better at this. I want some hand holding. That's part of the job, and it's also like the best part of the job. So
that's literally why we do our jobs. I think that's also important to say, is the reason that people who work in government relations do their jobs is to help other people talk to the government. So we like doing it. We like talking to people.
And there's probably already someone doing it on your behalf, so you might as well know who they are and establish a connection with them. And I will say, I just found out the other week that a meeting that I had maybe 3 weeks before everything got shut down last year. So like one of my last days on Capitol Hill, actually doing advocacy, we had literally a GSA member who was going to be in DC for a different event, but it was someone who knew me, and they were like, hey, I'd love to have some meetings with my people, with my representatives, my senators. Great, I'll set them up. And so because they were a GSA member, I was able to do that. We had these meetings. Literally a year later, just the last couple of weeks, I got an email from him saying, hey, so the representative and the staff actually came and visited the lab, because we always throw out this whole, like, if you're ever back in the district, because you're supposed to be sometimes when you're a representative, if you're ever back in the district, we'd love to show you the lab space that is getting this federal funding that we're asking for. And it actually happened. Like a year later, they showed up, they got to tour the facilities, and everyone had a great time. And it was like this really important day for the university being able to connect with their representative, and the department getting some great press out of it. And it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't just been the person to send some emails and set up a 15-minute meeting. So like it does have big impacts. It really does matter in the long-term scheme of things. So
yes.
That's awesome.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining me. This was a ton of fun. I kind of pitched this as Megan and I kind of concocted this scheme together to get us all on the podcast. And then, the Becca
and
and
appease
Caitlin
her dad.
Appease her dad, but I've been thinking about doing this for a while. I just
And
didn't
Mr.
have
Johnson.
But I'm so glad you all agreed to do it. And I think what a wonderful discussion of sort of the science that we've all worked on, but also this past year we've had together in the policy space. Another thing I said in my survey, and this is absolutely true, is that like our 1 hour sessions every month were basically therapy for me during the pandemic. I needed to vent with y'all. I'll apologize for all the times I got us off track immediately, but I'm not really.
It was the best part. No worries.
Yeah, do not apologize for that.
Couldn't agree more.
That's what I lived for in these meetings.
Yeah. Wait, Megan, was it you who said that you had a list of all the random like links and things I told you to look up? Or
pretty much, yeah. I have like basically all the tabs I have open on my browser right now are from you that you pop in the chat during our 1 hour meetings.
I would say, yeah. I just can't help myself.
Some of them have been really helpful though. And then other ones have just been really fun.
I'll take it. Which I think is an excellent way to sum up the Voices for Science experience. Really helpful, really fun.
Yay.
Thank you all for joining me. It was an absolute pleasure to chat with you all again. And hopefully it will not be the last time we all get to hop on a call and just shoot the breeze for an hour.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Hope to see you all in person.
Thanks,
sometime.
Ryan.
Yeah.
Someday.
Yes.
I hope you're huggers.
One day.
Yeah. Definitely.
It's Ryan a few weeks later, and I'm breaking good podcasting protocol and sitting in front of an open window while it's raining ever so slightly and cars are driving by outside because I ended up moving house recently. It was an unexpected early move, which put a delay and all sorts of other things in my life, as anyone who's ever done even a short in-town move knows. And then, of course, one of the things that we've been dealing with is the new place. Air conditioning doesn't work, and DC got hit with a nice little 90-plus degree heat wave. So while we're waiting for those repairs to be made, we have been doing our best to keep things cool with open windows. And I did turn off the fans, so at least there's not like a droning fan noise in the background. But hopefully the rain and the sound of the cars and the cicadas isn't too unpleasant on your ears. Anyway, I just want to say thanks again to Becca and Caitlin and Megan for talking to me, and I had such a good year chatting with them and having them, or being part of their team, I guess I should say, instead of saying having them on my team. We were all a team together. And yeah, with that, I just want to wrap up the episode with a very short PaleoPOW, and I want to thank Terry R. for being a recurring donor. We were remiss in thanking Terry back in the day. We were almost done fixing that back catalog of unthanked persons, and Terry is definitely one of them, and I know Terry has been a longtime listener to the show and has corresponded with us in the past. So, Terry, you are not forgotten, and you are very, very much appreciated for your contribution over the months and years that you've been a contributor. So thank you for that. And if you would like to become a contributor to the show, you can do so at patreon.com/sciencesortof. If you want to help us out in other ways, just by buying the things you might normally choose to buy, you can go to bookshop.org/sciencesortof for our affiliate page there. And yeah, hope you are all having a slightly less stressful, hectic, and more climate-controlled week than I am. We will be back next time, where you'll be sure to get a whole lot more science. And then I think I remember to get everyone to say sort of.
Sort of.
Audio production for Science Sort of is done by Rob Heath at Rob Heath Studios. Thanks, Rob.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
Although one One of my favorite movie moments was when I went and saw Endgame. Obviously, I was very excited about Endgame, was looking forward to it. And the moment, it's DC, it's a completely packed theater, something I'll probably never experience again. And the moment when old Steve shows up and hands Sam the shield, one guy in the theater just went, "Oh, hell yeah!" It was so funny. And I was like, good for you, buddy. I'm glad that moment hit.